People keep asking me to tell a good war story. My brother-in-law does it. The guys at the bar I go to sometimes, on the nights when I can't stand the quiet of the house, when Shelley is out and the rooms feel like rooms that belong to someone I used to be. They lean in. They want something cinematic. They want the moment a human soldier looked an alien in whatever it uses for eyes, and the alien flinched first. They want a story they can carry home and turn over in their hands and feel good about. I never give them that. I give them something else. I tell them about the checkpoint at Sector 9. I tell them about the 6 months I spent at the perimeter boundary of Settlement Cluster 12, which used to be Columbus, Ohio, watching people file in and out of their diminished lives through a gate we were paid in continued citizenship status, which was the only currency that mattered anymore, to operate on behalf of a species that measured us by our cortisol output and our compliance index. I tell them about the people in my unit, the ones who held and the ones who broke, and the ones who did something in between that doesn't have a clean name. I tell them about Sergeant First Class Sweet, who was the best of us, and Angel Salazar, who was 20 years old and wanted to make films. I tell them about Reno Flake and B.B. Rush, and what they decided to do to Farah Aldari and her family on a cold night in March. I tell them about what I did about it, what I couldn't do, and what I managed. Then I tell them that's my war story, and they can draw their own conclusions. They're usually quiet for a while after that. We were Alpha Company, 3rd Perimeter Control Battalion, assigned to Checkpoint 9 on the outer boundary of Settlement Cluster 12. The Varek had established the Settlement Cluster designation system in the 3rd month of occupation, after the main military phase concluded, and they transitioned to administrative control. What it meant in practice was that geographically distinct human population centers were incorporated into a grid system for resource allocation, movement control, and compliance monitoring. Cluster 12 covered approximately 40,000 residents. A cluster this size had 2 perimeter checkpoints. We ran the northern one. Used to be a gas station at the corner where the checkpoint sat. You could still see the concrete pad where the pump islands had been, and the shadow outline of the canopy in the discoloration of the asphalt. The Varek had installed their standard gate system over it, a pair of molecular scanners, 1 atmospheric sampling column, the amber pulsing light array for vehicle secondary challenge, and a prefabricated station for the duty administrator. The station was scaled for Varek proportions, which meant the ceiling was 2.5 meters, and the door frames were wide enough for something built very differently than a human body. We did our paperwork at a folding table outside it. Every person coming in or out of the settlement cluster had to stop at the gate. Biometric tag verification, which took about 4 seconds per person via the scanner. Atmospheric sampling on request, the Varek's way of testing for chemical markers associated with certain resistance activities, though I understood only pieces of how it worked, and questions if any reading flagged. Most days nothing flagged. Most days, several hundred people came through our gate on their way to work assignments or residency exchanges or supply distribution points, and they stopped and got scanned and kept their eyes forward and moved on. They didn't look at us. We were the face of the occupation. Nobody wants to look at that face for any longer than they have to. What I didn't understand when I first arrived was that we weren't just administering the gate. We were the buffer. We were the layer of human personnel between the settlement residents and direct Varek contact, which the Varek preferred to minimize because sustained human-Varek interaction generated stress hormones in the human population that degraded compliance metrics. We were more efficient than direct Varek management. We were cheaper, in the currencies the Varek optimized for. We were also, of course, complicit. I understood that from the beginning. I joined anyway because the alternative, the residency blocks, the ration tier, the movement restrictions, felt like a slower form of the same thing, and at least at the checkpoint I had some structural function that kept me from feeling entirely like inventory. That's the kind of reasoning occupation produces. I'm not proud of it. I'm telling you so you understand the environment that made all the rest of it possible. Sergeant First Class James Sweet had been in the perimeter service for 3 rotations. That was longer than almost anyone else at our checkpoint, longer than most people lasted before they either got transferred out or ground down to something that couldn't do the job anymore. The thing about Sweet was that he had found a way to do the work without letting it consume what he was. I watched him carefully in my first weeks there, trying to understand the mechanism, because I needed one. Part of it was that he maintained real distinctions. When he was at the gate, running the checkpoint, he was professional and precise and without sentiment, not cruel but not warm, because warmth was a luxury neither the residents nor the duty personnel could afford at a checkpoint. But when the shift ended and the gate was someone else's, he was a different thing. He told stories. He played cards badly and knew he played badly and didn't care. He asked about people's families, their lives before the occupation, what they'd studied, what they'd wanted to be. He remembered. He asked follow-up questions the next day or the next week. He was what my grandfather would have called a man who paid attention. He was also a man who had no illusions. I tested this early, about a week in, when I said something over dinner about the Varek governance framework and whether there were legitimate channels for addressing checkpoint grievances. Sweet listened to me finish. Then he said, "Lawyer, what you're describing exists on paper." He said, "I've been doing this for 3 rotations. I've seen what the paper means in practice." He said, "You do the job right, you treat the people coming through that gate like people, you keep your own people from doing something that can't be undone, and you go home." He said, "That's the ceiling." I said I understood. He said, "You don't yet, but you will." He was right on both counts. I want to tell you what Sweet's authority actually looked like in practice, because it's easy to describe a person as fair and hard to show what fairness costs and what it accomplishes. The checkpoint was not a place that rewarded fairness. The checkpoint rewarded efficiency, and efficiency in the Varek's framework meant processing volume. How many residents moved through the gate per hour? How many flags were generated? How many flags were resolved without escalation? A fair checkpoint operator and an efficient one could look identical in the metrics, but they felt different from the inside, and the residents knew the difference. They didn't look at us, but they knew the difference. What Sweet did, and I watched him closely because I needed to learn it, was treat every decision as though someone who mattered would review it later. Not the Varek administrative record, which reviewed everything but had no categories for fairness. Something else. Some internal audit he ran on himself, some standard he was meeting that wasn't in any official framework. When a resident triggered an atmospheric flag that Sweet read as ambiguous, he asked questions the way a person asks questions rather than the way a processing system asks questions. He gave the benefit of the doubt where the doubt was genuinely present. He was consistent from one resident to the next in ways that residents noticed, and that built, over time, a kind of credit between the checkpoint and the people who passed through it. Not trust, exactly, because occupation makes trust impossible, but something adjacent to trust. The sense that this particular gate, run by this particular man, was not going to invent reasons to make your life worse. When he died, the residents who came through the gate the following day, the ones who knew, which was most of them, because news moved through a settlement cluster faster than the Varek's communication monitoring could track, came through differently. Some of them glanced at where Sweet usually stood, a quick involuntary look, and then looked away. That was how I knew what his presence had actually meant. He was right on both counts. Gabe Blix was 24, from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of quiet that comes from spending a lot of time alone rather than from shyness. He wore glasses that the military-issue corrective lenses program kept replacing because he kept sitting on them, and he carried a beaten paperback of John O'Hara's Appointment in Samara in his breast pocket at all times. He'd been halfway through it since before I arrived, and would be halfway through it when I left. Either the book was very long or the checkpoint didn't give a person much uninterrupted reading time. Probably both. He was the unit's K-9 handler. His dog was named Kevin, a Malinois mix with a calm intelligence that made him seem like the most professionally competent member of the unit, which may have been accurate. Kevin could detect the molecular markers associated with repurposed Varek ordnance at a range of about 40 meters, which was a capability the Varek's own detection equipment couldn't match in complex atmospheric environments. The Varek found this interesting in the way they found many things about us interesting, with a kind of precise, uninvested curiosity, the way a biologist notes an unexpected adaptation in a study species. Blix loved that dog the way some people love their children, which I say without irony or diminishment. In a posting that offered very little that was uncomplicated or clean, Kevin was both. Reno Flake and BB Rush are harder to describe without falling into the easy vocabulary of evil, which I want to resist because it's not accurate, and because it lets the situation off the hook. Flake was 22, from outside Reno, Nevada, with a kind of compressed anger that had never found a constructive channel. He was not stupid. This is important. He was in fact intelligent in a specific way, the intelligence of someone who reads the room accurately and uses what he sees efficiently. He read power dynamics the way a predator reads terrain. He knew where the edges were and how close he could get to them without consequence. Under different circumstances, that skill might have been a good thing. Rush was his complement, larger, slower to think independently, content to find his identity in Flake's orbit. He wasn't malicious in the way Flake was malicious. He was more like the mechanism by which Flake's malice became physical. I'm not sure how much exculpation that offers him. And then there was Angel Salazar. Angel was 20 years old and had enrolled in the perimeter service for the education benefit. The GI pathway to university was one of the few remaining routes to higher education after the occupation's restructuring of civilian institutions, and he wanted to study filmmaking. He told me this on my second day when he came and asked if he could record me for his ongoing documentation project. I said yes. I don't know entirely why I said yes. Partly loneliness. Partly something in the way he asked. He was always very specific about asking permission, always explained what he was making and why, always gave the person being recorded the option to decline without pressure. He treated the camera as a serious object, which I found in that context surprisingly moving. He was making what he called a document of the real experience, not a film about the occupation as a political event, but a record of what it felt like to be a specific set of people in a specific place, doing a specific difficult job at a specific point in history. He believed that record was important. He believed it would matter. I have thought about this often since. I was Barton McCoy. Lawyer, as I said, 2 years of law school before the occupation put civilian institutions into suspended operation, which was the bureaucratic term for shutting them down while keeping the buildings. I was 28. I was married to a woman named Shelley, who was also a lawyer, who worked for one of the human rights documentation firms that operated in the limited space the Varek administrative framework allowed for such things. She was more useful to the resistance in the broadest sense than I was. I was running a checkpoint. I sent her recordings most nights. She sent them back. She had a way of sitting at our kitchen table, in the particular light that came through the window over the sink in the late afternoon, that made the kitchen look like the center of everything that mattered. I watched those recordings a lot in the nights at Checkpoint 9, which is the kind of thing you do when you're trying to remember who you are. The Varek. I want to give you an accurate picture because the inaccurate ones fail in both directions. They make the Varek either monstrous or inhuman, when the truth is something more uncomfortable. They are neither. They are a different kind of thing, and the difference is what makes dealing with them so profoundly difficult. They are physically large. The administrators who staffed the checkpoint stations ran about 2.5 meters at the shoulder of the upper torso, which is where their anatomy begins to diverge most obviously from ours. The torso is jointed differently, a mid-trunk articulation that allows a forward lean you'd call a bow, except it isn't social signaling. It's just how they look at things close to the ground. Their integument is scaled along the dorsal surface, the scales darkening toward a ridge plate structure that runs from the crown of what passes for the head down to the base of the spine. Ventral surface is lighter, almost translucent in some of the older administrators, and visibly vascular in a way that's disconcerting until you get used to it. 4 upper limbs, 2 lower, the upper 2 functioning as what we'd call arms, and the other 2 as secondary manipulation appendages used for fine work. Vision apparatus that doesn't resolve in the visual spectrum the way ours does. They perceive in ranges we can't, and miss things we see easily, which is one of the reasons our dogs were useful to them. But the real difference is the one you can't observe directly. Varek's social organization is pheromone-mediated. Individual Varek communicate through language. They've learned our major ones, and their translation units handle the rest with reasonable accuracy, but their primary cognitive and social experience is chemical. They operate within what they call the cluster signal, a continuous biochemical conversation produced by the aggregate pheromonal output of their social group, which shapes individual decisions and behaviors the way ambient temperature shapes the behavior of a cold-blooded animal. It's not hive mind in the science fiction sense. Individual Varek have distinct personalities, preferences, skills. It's more that the moral weight of decisions is distributed through the group in a way that makes individual moral accountability almost meaningless as a concept. No single Varek makes a decision the way we understand making a decision. Every decision is downstream of the cluster signal, which is downstream of centuries of accumulated social pheromone practice, which is downstream of a biology that evolved to function this way, because functioning this way worked. What this means for dealing with them is this. When a Varek administrator tells you that civilian welfare falls outside the operational mandate, that individual administrator is not being cruel. Cruelty implies a choice. The administrator is reporting a fact about the cluster signal parameters, the same way a thermostat reports temperature. The moral architecture of the decision was made elsewhere, by a process that no individual Varek chose or controls. Understanding this made it easier to deal with the overseer on a daily basis. It made it harder to deal with what happened in March. The overseer was the Varek administrator assigned to Checkpoint 9. He was formal, precise, and consistent in a way I had learned to read as something like fairness, even though fairness implies values, and I'm not sure the overseer had values in the sense I mean. He had parameters. Within them, he was predictable. He responded to well-constructed arguments. He had what I can only describe as a respect for logical consistency, which manifested as something you could use if you knew how to use it. I learned how to use it. It wasn't enough in the end, but it wasn't nothing. The pregnant woman's name was Hessa Al-Maktoum. She was 31 years old. She was 1 week from delivery when the car she was in approached Checkpoint 9 on a Wednesday evening in February and failed to stop at secondary challenge. I wasn't on duty when it happened. I heard it, the shots, and then the sound of a vehicle coasting to a stop, which is a distinctive sound, heavier and more gradual than a normal stop, and which I will never be able to hear again without knowing what it means. I came out of the station and Flake was standing in front of the car with his weapon still raised, and his face was completely empty. The particular emptiness of a person who has just done a thing and is waiting to find out what the thing is. The driver was Tariq Al-Maktoum, Hess's husband. He was unhurt. He was also, in those first minutes, completely silent in the way that people go silent when the shock is still absorbing, when the understanding hasn't caught up yet to what the body already knows. He was looking at his wife and he was not making any sound. The secondary challenge signal is an amber light array that pulses in a specific pattern above the gate. The pattern is in Varek traffic code, which is a system designed for Varek perceptual ranges and has no intuitive meaning for human drivers. Tariq had been briefed, as all settlement cluster residents were briefed, on what the amber light meant. The briefing had been administered in English, because the Varek language program had not yet developed the tools for Tarek's primary language. His English was limited. He had attended the briefing. He had not understood it fully. He had seen the amber light and interpreted it as caution, which in every human traffic system he had ever encountered was what amber meant. The rules of engagement were explicit. Vehicles that failed to stop at secondary challenge were to be stopped by any means necessary. The security rationale was solid. Resistance cells had used vehicles to move personnel and equipment through restricted zone boundaries, and 2 previous incidents at other checkpoints had resulted in Varek personnel casualties. The rules had been in place for 4 months. Flake had applied them. The overseer reviewed the incident recording that night. The finding he issued the following morning said, "Justified interdiction under current rules of engagement, case closed." Sweet called a unit meeting that evening. He didn't shout. He never shouted. He stood at the end of the folding table in the station's outer room and looked at each of us in turn, and there was something in his expression that had changed from the previous day, not broken, nothing like that, but shifted in a way that meant he had recalibrated something fundamental and was making sure the adjustment was visible. He said, "The rules of engagement say what they say." He said, "Rules of engagement are written to cover operational scenarios, and they can't cover every individual situation, which is why we have judgment, and judgment is what I'm telling you to use." He said, "That car had a woman in it who was a week from having a child, a man who drove too fast through a light he didn't understand." He said, "We are going to do this job according to procedure, and we are also going to remember every day that the people coming through that gate are people, and those 2 things are not in opposition, no matter how it can feel like they are." He was looking at Flake when he said the last part. Flake met his eyes and said nothing. I went to the overseer the following morning. I said I wanted to discuss the rules of engagement around the secondary challenge signal. I said the current signal format was producing false positives among residents with limited familiarity with Varek traffic code, and that this was generating unnecessary casualties. I said I had a proposed alternative signal format that would be more legible to human drivers. The overseer received this in his particular way, which was to be completely still while I spoke and then process in silence for several seconds afterward. Then he said, "The signal format is standardized across all settlement cluster checkpoints in this administrative zone." He said, "Modification requires approval from the Regional Governance Board." He said, "I can forward your proposal with a recommendation for review." I said I would appreciate that. I drafted a formal proposal and submitted it through the administrative queue. The Regional Governance Board acknowledged receipt 7 weeks later. As of when I left Checkpoint 9, the signal format had not changed. I'm telling you this so you understand what the legitimate channels looked like. March came in cold and wet, the kind of cold that makes everything at an outdoor posting slightly miserable in ways that accumulate. The equipment shelter over the secondary scanning lane had a moisture seal problem that the tech team had been requisitioning replacement parts for since before I arrived. And every damp day was another increment of degradation to the scanning accuracy, and another reason for the Varek administrator to log a maintenance deficiency in the checkpoint's performance record. Blix developed a cough. Kevin the dog developed one too, which Blix treated with veterinary-grade medications he'd sourced through channels he declined to specify, and which Kevin accepted with the stoic professionalism he applied to everything. Rush and Flake were bad in the way weather is bad, not dramatically, not in specific incidents you could point to, but in a way you felt in the texture of being near them, the way certain kinds of pressure systems make the air feel wrong before the storm. They drank when they could get alcohol, which was against regulations and not particularly difficult to manage given the supply networks that had developed in the settlement clusters. They played cards with a grimness that was about something other than cards. They talked about the occupation in ways that started as complaint, which was normal, which was everyone, and moved into something uglier, The kind of talk where the logic of grievance slowly becomes the logic of permission. I noticed this. Sweet noticed it. Sweet had a technique. He would interrupt the talk with a task, something specific and immediate that redirected the energy. It worked because Sweet's authority had weight that could redirect things. I didn't have that authority, and Blix didn't, and Angel certainly didn't. We could notice. We could log the noticing somewhere private. We couldn't do much else. Angel recorded some of it. He told me one night on the late watch that he was making choices now about what the truth required. He'd started the project thinking that truth was comprehensive, everything you could capture, cataloged, and preserved. He was revising this. He said, "I think the truth is what the record means, not what it contains. I think there are some things that would just be a record of ugliness, and I don't think that's true in the way I mean truth. I'm still figuring it out." I told him I thought he was figuring it out correctly. He filmed the checkpoint. He filmed the residents coming through, with their permission. He always asked, always explained, always accepted refusal without argument, which meant some people said yes who otherwise wouldn't have. He filmed Blix reading his perpetually half-finished book. He filmed Sweet running a shift brief, which had a quality to it I could only describe as dignity, Sweet treating the mundane operational details of checkpoint management as though they genuinely mattered, which they did, because everything that prevented things from getting worse genuinely mattered. He filmed me doing paperwork at the folding table. He filmed Kevin sitting with alert patience at Blix's feet. He filmed Flake and Rush less. He told me he wasn't sure what to do with those recordings when he had them. He was still deciding. On the 11th of March, Sergeant First Class James Sweet stepped on a pressure-activated Varek munition that had been repurposed by a resistance cell and planted in the roadway 63 meters north of the checkpoint. The device detonated when his left heel came down on it at the correct angle. The blast radius was approximately 4 meters. Sweet was the only person in the blast radius. He was dead before the medical team reached him. The Varek emergency protocol required a full threat assessment of the blast site before human medics were authorized to enter the area. The assessment took 14 minutes. 14 minutes was 12 minutes longer than would have mattered. I filed a complaint about the emergency response protocol timing. The complaint was received and logged. The protocol was not changed. The 6 days after Sweet died were the worst 6 days of the posting. In some ways worse than what came after, because what came after was at least clear in its shape. The 6 days after Sweet were a deterioration that felt like it could be arrested at any moment and wasn't. I don't mean that we fell apart functionally. We ran the checkpoint. People came through and got scanned and moved on. Blix handled Kevin. I did the administrative work, which had grown because Sweet had handled a layer of it I hadn't fully mapped until it was mine. The Varek overseer continued to occupy his station and issue his precise directives. The gate operated. What deteriorated was the thing Sweet had maintained that wasn't the gate. The sense that we were a unit with a shared purpose that included treating the work and the people involved in it as though they mattered. Without Sweet, that sense had no anchor and it moved. For Blix and me, it moved inward. We got quieter, more careful, more aware of what we were responsible for keeping intact in ourselves. For Flake and Rush, it moved outward, and it moved into a place I recognized but didn't know how to name yet. The place where grievance becomes permission becomes planning. On the 5th night after Sweet's death, Flake came and found me in the equipment room at 2200 hours. He sat down on a supply crate without asking and looked at me for a moment before he spoke. And in the look, I could see that he had decided something, and that the decision had a quality of deliberateness to it that I associated with men who had crossed some internal line that they weren't going to step back over. He told me there was a family in the northern residency block. He gave me their address. He told me the girl's name, Farah Aldari, 15 years old, and he told me what he and Rush were planning to do on the following night. He said it without affect. That was the part that was worse to be in the room with, the flatness of it, the absence of any shame or excitement or any emotional register that I could use to find a crack, something human to appeal to. He was reporting a plan the way you report weather. I told him he was not going to do that. I said it clearly and without hedging. He looked at me and said, "Sweet is dead, lawyer," he said. "Do you understand what that means? The balance has shifted," he said. "Nobody here is going to stop us, and you know that." I said I would report it to the overseer. He said the overseer didn't care what happened to families in the residency blocks. He said, "You know I'm right about that. Don't make me say it in a way that's bad for you." I said I was reporting it regardless. He stood up. He said, "You do what you need to do." He said it without heat, which was somehow the worst version of those words I'd ever heard. I went to the overseer at 2140 hours. I sat in the chair across from his desk, a human desk, in the only space the station had that a human could use comfortably, surrounded by the environmental modifications the Varek required in their workspaces. And I made my report using the most precise language I had. 2 members of my unit had communicated a specific intent to commit a violent crime against specific civilian residents of the settlement cluster at a specific address. I had names. I had the address. I had a timeline. I was requesting immediate intervention. The overseer listened with his full sensory array engaged. When I finished, he was still for the habitual processing period. Then he said, "The behavioral tendency you are describing is consistent with human unit cohesion parameters under grief stress and falls within acceptable variance for perimeter control personnel at this rotation point." I said, "They are going to rape a 15-year-old child and murder her family." He said, "Your concern is noted. Your unit's functional status is the primary compliance metric for this checkpoint. Non-standard individual behavioral outputs in the short term are within tolerance if unit function is maintained." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about what I knew about the Varek, about the cluster signal, about the architecture of a moral universe built without individual accountability. I thought about whether the concept I was about to articulate had any pathway into the framework he operated within. I said, "You're telling me you don't care." He said, "I am telling you that human civilian welfare in non-functional impact scenarios falls outside my operational mandate." I want to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I have sat with it for years and it still costs something every time. Non-functional impact scenarios. Farah Aldari and her family in the operational calculus of the Varek administrative system did not function. They did not work the checkpoint, did not maintain equipment, did not process residents, did not contribute to any metric that the system tracked. They existed in the residency block, consuming their allocated resources, which the system also tracked, and they were alive, which the system also tracked. But what happened to them in the space between those measurements was outside the mandate. I left his station and went back to the unit. I found Blix and told him what was happening and what the overseer had said. Blix absorbed this in the way he absorbed difficult information, which was to go very still for a count of several seconds, and then his face did something complicated that ended in a kind of grim resolution. He said, "What do we do?" I said I was going to the house. I said I needed him to stay, to hold the checkpoint overnight, because one of us had to. He started to argue. I said, "Gabe, stay." He looked at me for a moment and then he said all right and reached down and put his hand briefly on Kevin's head in a way that might have been comfort for either of them. I found Angel. I told him where I was going and why. He looked at me and then he looked at his recorder and then he looked at me again. He said, "I want to come." I said I knew. I said he could. He picked up the recorder. We followed them at a distance. I had a sidearm regulation issue, and I had no intention of using it on members of my own unit unless the alternative was watching them kill someone, which was a line I had thought about carefully and was clear on. Angel had his recorder. That was what we had. The walk to the northern residency block was about 20 minutes. The settlement cluster at night was quiet in the specific way that occupied places are quiet, not peaceful, but subdued. The quietness of people who have learned to be small at night because drawing attention at night has costs. A few windows lit. The green pulse of compliance beacons at intersection points, every 3 blocks, the Varek's grid made visible. The Aldari house was in the middle of the block, a row house with a small front area that had been a garden once and was now just ground, winter bare. There was a light on upstairs. The family was home. Flake went to the door. He had, I realized, some kind of pass authorization. He'd taken a checkpoint access chip from the supply station, one of the blank ones used for temporary administrative clearances. The door lock read it and opened. I hadn't known he'd planned that far ahead. I should have checked. I put myself in the doorway when I could. I said Flake's name. I said his name a second time. He turned and looked at me with that same flatness, the absence of any emotion that could be reached, and Rush came up behind me and put his forearm across my throat and the rifle barrel against the side of my head, and Flake said in a very calm voice that I had 5 seconds to get out of the doorway, and something in his voice told me with complete clarity that the count was real. I stepped back. I stood on the ground in front of the house and I listened to what happened inside, and I will not describe it to you in detail because the detail is not the point, and because some things should not be reproduced, only acknowledged. Angel was beside me. He had the recorder and he was making his choice about what truth required, and the choice he made was to keep the recorder running but to film the outside of the house, the lit window, the quiet street, the compliance beacon pulsing 3 blocks away. To make a record that said, this happened here, at this address, on this night, in a settlement cluster that was administered by an authority that had been told and did not act. That was enough. It turned out that was enough. When it was over, Flake and Rush came out. Flake looked at Angel's recorder. He said the footage was not going anywhere. Angel said it was his recorder. Flake said he knew whose recorder it was. Rush moved toward Angel. I stepped between them. There was a moment where everything balanced on the physics of what Flake decided next, and then Flake said Rush's name in a specific tone and Rush stopped. They walked away down the street. I watched them go until I couldn't see them anymore. The family was alive. I want to say that clearly and without the qualification it might seem to need. Farah Aldari and her family survived. What happened to them was real and the harm was real and survival doesn't erase any of it. But they were alive, and that mattered. Angel and I stood there for a long time without saying anything. I made a recording that night. I sat at the folding table in the station's outer room with Angel's recorder, borrowed, and I described everything that had happened since the afternoon, Flake's visit to the equipment room, my conversation with the overseer, what I had witnessed, what I had tried and failed to do. I described it in the language of a legal declaration, because that's the vocabulary I had, and because the vocabulary of a legal declaration is designed to create a record that can survive being contested. I transmitted it to Shelley through our personal channel. I marked it urgent. I told her I needed her to hold it, to keep it somewhere outside the installation's communications archive, to treat it the way she would treat evidence. She sent back a recording the following morning. She was at the kitchen table and the particular light was there, and her face was very still in the way it got when she was processing something difficult without letting the difficulty reach her expression. She said, "Barton, I need you to be careful," she said. "I understand what you've sent me and I understand what you want to do with it." She said, "Be careful about sequence. Do things in the right order," she said. "I love you." I spent 3 days being careful about sequence. On the 4th day, Angel went to the sector exchange to purchase a data transfer chip. He'd been archiving his recordings to an external server throughout the posting, an off-site backup for the film project, and he was overdue for a sync. He told me where he was going. He told Blix. He said he'd be back by 1800. He didn't come back. The The Varek security incident report that was filed the following morning placed him in a crossfire between a resistance cell and Varek enforcement personnel in the market sector. 2 kilometers from the exchange he'd told me he was going to, 40 minutes after he'd left our site. The report gave his time of death, the unit that had responded, the threat assessment outcome. Everything in the report was precise and internally consistent, the way Varek reports always were. The coordinate discrepancy was not something you'd notice unless you'd been to that sector and knew the layout. I noticed. Blix and I read the report at the folding table. Blix read it twice. He put it down on the table and looked at it for a moment and said nothing. I didn't say what I was thinking, because if I said it in the installation, it would be in the installation's monitoring record, and the monitoring record had the same administrator the incident report had. I went to Sweet's bunk and I sat there for a long time. Sweet's bunk had been stripped when his effects were shipped, so there was just the frame and the bare mattress, and I sat on it and thought about Angel, 20 years old, asking permission before he recorded anything, saying he was going to capture something true. I thought about what the truth was now and where it was, and what I needed to do to make it survive. Then I went to the equipment room. Angel had a second recorder in his locker. He'd had 2, because he'd told me once that you always archived your most important footage on at least 2 separate devices, on the same principle as a lawyer keeping copies of everything in separate locations. His locker hadn't been cleared yet. The second recorder was there, with the footage from the night at the Aldari house on it. I took it. What I did over the next 4 months was not heroic. I want to be clear about this because I know what heroic looks like, and it looks like Sweet, who was fair every day in a situation that made fairness cost something. What I did was more like persistent clerical work, combined with the specific stubbornness of someone who has decided that giving up would cost more than continuing. I filed memoranda. I had a legal education, and I knew how to write documents that were difficult to route into administrative voids. The Varek administrative system had a formal complaints process that existed because the co-administration compact required it, and the compact's language was precise in ways that occasionally proved useful. I cited subclause 742, which covered civilian welfare in controlled settlement zones. I cited the operational log entries that placed Flake and Rush off station on the night of the 14th. I cited the coordinate discrepancy in Angel's incident report. I cited my conversation with the overseer. I also, simultaneously and through entirely separate channels, began building the external record. Shelley's law practice had contacts in the human rights documentation networks that operated in the outer sectors, organizations that had learned to exist in the spaces the Varek administrative framework didn't bother to fill in, because the Varek administrative framework didn't see human civil society as an operational concern. Through Shelley, through her encrypted communications, through a series of handoffs I was careful about in ways that I will not detail, I got Angel's footage and my memoranda to people who had the technical expertise to authenticate them. The overseer called me in twice during this period. Both times he said, in language that was precise without being explicitly threatening, that my administrative activity was generating complexity at governance levels above his operational tier. Both times I said I understood that, and that I intended to continue. Both times he received this with his characteristic stillness and processed it, and then said something that I logged carefully in the external record. The second time he said, "You understand that the individuals responsible for the incident you are documenting are beyond the remediation reach of the reports you are filing." I said, "Probably." He said, "Then what is the purpose?" I thought about this. I thought about Angel and Farah Aldari and the 15-year-old girl in the mathematics program who had tested well and wanted to be an engineer. I thought about what Angel had said about records and truth. I said, the purpose is the record itself. I said, Farah Aldari is a person. Angel Salazar was a person. The record of what happened to them is the only thing that survives in your system when everything else is processed and filed and closed. If nobody makes that record, it's as if they were inventory. They aren't inventory. The overseer was still for a very long time. His sensory array tracked me throughout. Then he said, "This motivation is not operationally functional." I said, "No, it isn't." He considered this for another moment, and then he said something that I was not expecting. He said, "In Varek governance history, there is no precedent for individual moral witness as a destabilizing social mechanism. The cluster signal corrects for dissent at the individual level before it can become systemic." I said, "I know." He said, "This is a form of persistence that our models do not adequately account for." I said, "I know that too." He let me go. I went back to the folding table and kept filing. In August, the documentation network broadcast the material through a station outside the Varek-administered zone. I don't know the technical details of how they managed the transmission. I know the broadcast reached people, because the Varek administrative system logged what the overseer's office described as a significant volume anomaly in incoming human communication traffic over the following week, which was the bureaucratic rendering of the fact that a very large number of people had transmitted responses to what they'd seen, through every channel available to them, in every language they had, to every Varek administrative address they could identify. The human communication channels, the partially functional ones, the ones that operated in the compliance margins, were full for days. I monitored what I could access from the checkpoint. What I saw was not coordinated. It was not organized resistance in the tactical sense. It was something harder to categorize, and I came to understand, harder for the Varek to respond to. Individual people, in their thousands, insisting that the record exist. Insisting that Farah al-Dari's name be in the file. Insisting that what had happened, and that someone with authority should account for it. Some of the transmissions were angry. Some were careful and formal, written in the language of legal petitions, which meant that someone out there had been thinking about jurisdiction and documentation the same way I had. Some were nothing more than a name, Farah al-Dari, Angel Salazar, repeated in message after message, a kind of collective insistence that these people existed and had weight and could not be processed into non-functional impact scenarios. I read as many of them as I could access. I thought about Angel, who had understood before any of us that a record was what it meant that something had happened. I thought he would have had something precise and true to say about what he was seeing. The Varek administrative system received this input and processed it as anomalous, in a pheromone-mediated social structure. When the collective signal produces an output that conflicts with operational parameters, the cluster recalibrates. The individual components of the cluster, the administrators, the regional governors, the inter-cluster governance board, experience this recalibration not as a decision being made, but as a consensus emerging, the way a flock of birds changes direction. No single bird leads. The system leads. What the system concluded, eventually, was that the anomaly had operational implications at levels above routine perimeter management, and that these implications required formal review. The Varek Inter-Cluster Governance Board issued a review order in September covering the al-Dari incident and the death of Angel Salazar. I was formally notified. The notification used language that was careful in ways that told me someone in the governance structure had read my memoranda with attention. The review took 6 weeks. It was conducted with Varek precision, which meant that every piece of evidence was examined, every timeline was reconstructed, every coordinate discrepancy was noted and explained. The review board had no particular investment in any outcome. They were not covering for local administrators, because Varek administrators don't cover for each other in the human sense, because the cluster signal makes intragroup loyalty function differently. They were establishing facts. The facts they established were the facts of the record I had made. Flake was located in Sector 7, Eastern Administrative Zone. Rush was in Sector 4. I was not informed of the specific outcome of the review's findings regarding them. The Varek don't explain their disciplinary proceedings. What I inferred from the nature of the review and from conversations with Shelley, who had contacts in the governance monitoring networks, was that the outcome was efficient and final. The Varek are, above most things, efficient. The review board did not apologize. The Varek governance framework has no protocol for apology, which requires an acknowledgement of individual moral responsibility that the cluster signal architecture makes functionally impossible. What the board did was issue a reclassification of the Al-Dari incident from civilian behavioral event to unauthorized personnel action, and a separate reclassification of the Salazar death from resistance-related crossfire casualty to unlawful unit action. Both reclassifications triggered remediation protocols. Both updated the case file, which now had the correct names in it, the correct sequence of events, the correct account. The board also, through administrative channels I couldn't entirely follow, notified the provisional education program that Farah Al-Dari's placement had been reviewed under the remediation protocol and upgraded to the primary tier, with full resource allocation. I don't know if she knows why. I don't know if it matters whether she knows. My rotation ended in October. Sergeant First Class Oduya, who had arrived in May and run a clean, precise operation for the last months of my time at the checkpoint, shook my hand at the gate on my last day. She said, "You made a lot of paperwork for a lot of people." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She said it without irony, which I appreciated. Blix was already gone by then, rotation complete 2 months before mine. He'd shaken my hand on his last day and said, "You should have let me go with you that night." I'd said he would have done exactly what I did, which was almost nothing, and there was no reason for both of us to carry it. He'd looked at me for a moment and said, "You didn't do nothing, lawyer." Then he'd picked up his bag and called Kevin to heel and walked to the transport. The trip home took 3 days. Settlement cluster transit to regional hub to Continental Administrative Center, Continental Center to civilian dispersal point. A lot of waiting in a lot of places that had the quality occupation gives to transit spaces, functional, efficient, and emptied of anything that wasn't function. I sat in the waiting areas and watched people and thought about what I was going home to, and whether I was still the person who had left. Shelley was at the dispersal point. I had told her not to make a thing of it, that I just wanted to come home quietly, and she had respected that, which meant she was there with no sign, no announcement, just herself, standing near the exit in the particular way she stood when she was containing something. We hugged for a long time without saying anything. She'd made dinner. We sat at the kitchen table with the light coming through the window over the sink, the same light that had been in all her recordings, and we ate and talked, and I told her most of it, not in the formal sequence of a legal declaration, but in the way you tell the person who knows you everything that has to be told. She listened. She asked questions. She did not tell me I had done enough, because she knew I was not asking that. My brother-in-law came for dinner 3 weeks after I got back. He'd had a couple of drinks, and he was in the mode he got into, expansive and slightly too loud, where he wanted something from the room that he couldn't quite name. He said, "Come on, tell me a war story. The real kind. The kind where a human looks one of those things in the face and it backs down." I told him what I've just told you. I told him all of it. Sweet dying on the road 60 meters from the gate. The overseer and his operational mandate. Flake and the empty expression and the calm, terrible planning. Standing outside the house while Angel made his choice. Filing the memoranda into the administrative void. The 6 weeks of the review board and the reclassifications and Farah Al-Dari's placement getting upgraded because a piece of paperwork said her name in the right column. When I finished, my brother-in-law was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not what I meant." He said, "That's not a war story. Where's the moment? Where do you win?" I said, "We did win." I said, "Farah Al-Dari is in the primary education tier studying mathematics. Angel's footage is in the authenticated archive, and the Varek Intercluster Governance Board has a file with his name in it that says what happened to him. The Varek governance structure has documented, in its own records, that a 15-year-old girl in a settlement cluster in what used to be Ohio is a person, not a non-functional impact scenario. He said, nobody even knows it happened. I said, Farah knows. The documentation networks know. The people who watched the broadcast know. The Varek governance record knows, and that record will be there in 100 years. I said, you know, I just told you. He said, but nothing changed. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about what I'd said to the overseer, about the record being what it meant that something happened. I thought about Angel asking permission before he filmed, always explaining what he was making and why. I said, the Varek governance structure encountered something it had no model for. Not a bomb, not organized resistance. One soldier who knew how to write a memorandum, and one kid with a camera, and a species that has spent its entire history insisting that what happens to one person matters enough to write down. I said, they colonized a planet and they had no framework for that. They had no cluster signal that accounts for individual moral witness persisting past the point where it stops being operationally viable. I said, they're going to have to build one now, or they're going to keep encountering it, in 1,000 different checkpoints and 1,000 different situations, and it's going to keep generating anomalies their system doesn't know how to process. I said that's what they walked into when they came here. That's what we are. My brother-in-law didn't say anything after that. We finished dinner. He went home. I washed the dishes and looked out the window at the neighborhood in the dark. The Varek streetlights, their efficient blue-white. The compliance beacon 2 blocks over, green and steady. The occupied planet, the managed population, all of it still there, still the same. Except for the case file. Except for the record. Except for a 15-year-old girl in a mathematics program who had, by the bureaucratic consequence of someone insisting her name be in the right column, a slightly better chance at whatever the future turned out to hold. I dried my hands on the dish towel and turned off the kitchen light and went to find Shelley. The record exists. Angel made it and I kept it, and it will outlast the checkpoint and the overseer and probably both of us. He did capture something true. He really did. He did.